I do not believe that being First Lady should prevent me from expressing my ideas.
Betty Ford was more than just a First Lady. She stood on the world stage as her own woman, and tonight we're going to celebrate the life and times of Betty Ford with Matt McLogan, who is spokesperson for the Ford Foundation. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Patrick.
And Marty Allen, Chairman Emeritus for the Ford Foundation. Thank you for being here.
Nice to be here.
Well, we'd like to be together on perhaps different terms, but we're truly going to celebrate Betty. What a woman. I mean, when you look back in time and when she became First Lady, she found her voice in essence, and she became her own woman alongside with Jerry, who was really a cornerstone of politics in Washington, but together they were quite a team.
They were. They really were. But it's interesting, you know, her start, people think sort of came when he became vice president or president, but if you really look at her history, it started when she was a young girl. She formed a lot of characteristics that blossomed when she became First Lady. When she was at Central High School, she and a couple of her classmates were interested in style, and they did something that seems rather insignificant at the time. All the girls used to wear cardigan sweaters that buttoned up the back, and they reversed them and buttoned them back, and it became a style in Grand Rapids. And eventually she became a model.
And what does that say about her?
Well, I tell you something, she knew how to have fun, and she really enjoyed life. And I'll talk about that a little bit later. But she also sometimes had too much fun. She, when she started dancing and with Martha Graham here, Martha Graham moved to New York, and in that day it was very hard to believe that she could do it, but she left home with permission and went to New York to dance under Martha Graham there. But it wasn't very long thereafter that her mother called her back to Grand Rapids because she said she was having too much fun. So, you know, that really had a beginning a long time ago that came out later, too.
When you look at that Grand Rapids element, I think that's one of the things that make us all love her as much as we do. I mean, this is a family affair that this city has with this first family, and it just lives on, and it goes back to some of the roots of this city, her days as a dancer, and the dance, I guess, where she met Jerry out at the Kent Country Club.
The story is that some mutual friends tried to hook them up. This was after Betty Ford, or Betty Bloomer Warren at that point, was divorcing from her first husband. And she had said, I'm not really interested in another marriage. I don't want to meet anybody. And her friends insisted, and so they arranged for each to see the other. And the family lore is that Jerry Ford was smitten when he saw her and was persistent in calling and trying to get her to agree to a date. And she said, well, you know, maybe we could have coffee at Herpelsheimer's where she was working. And that, from that to a date to marriage in less than a year.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because a lot of their friends were married as well,
oh, yeah.
And so it was time to tie the knot.
Yeah.
But it was done in a very interesting way. They became engaged in the winter of 1948, and Jerry Ford suggested that they could not get married until fall because there was something he needed to do first. And only after they were engaged, isn't this right, Marty?
Yes, you're right
did he tell her that he was planning to run for Congress.
Yeah.
And this will seem curious, Patrick, to you and me because we've covered politics in this century, but Jerry Ford declared his candidacy for Congress against an incumbent Republican in June of the election year, mm-hmm. and beat him in August. Mm-hmm. Bartel Yonkman, who was the incumbent, mm-hmm. and Jerry Ford became a member of Congress by having taken out a member of his own party, which is a very unusual way to get to Congress and ever become a leader, which says a great deal about the real fiber of Jerry Ford.
Particularly at that time. I mean, that was just unheard of. The interesting thing, and Matt was absolutely accurate, but their honeymoon was in Jackson, Michigan. That was the other thing he didn't quite tell her, that their honeymoon was going to be in Jackson, Michigan at the Republican convention. And I didn't know this till later. He told me this himself, that he promised her he would take her on a cruise sometime as a honeymoon. And he then had gone in the Navy and almost washed over the side in the typhoon on the Monterey, and would prefer not to ever go on a ship again. But about 10 years ago, he made that commitment come true. He took her on a cruise, and they had so much fun, they went on a couple other ones. And that's a great end of that story that you told, that how it all unfolded. And knowing the president, he probably never forgot he made that commitment. And knowing her, she probably didn't let him forget either.
Well, she didn't, and he said often, I never heard the end of it, because they went from Jackson to Ann Arbor to a UM football game, and then to Owasso, the hometown of Thomas E. Dewey, the Republican candidate for president in 1948, because Dewey was making an appearance in his hometown. And so poor Betty had the hat trick of all of these things that had nothing whatever to do with her honeymoon.
Yeah.
So she's been a spectator, now she's a part of this.
Yeah.
And they move off to Washington, which at that time she was more or less of a housewife, taking care of 4 kids, while he's out
Doing
of town
a lot
running.
He's out of town a lot. He really felt strongly about being a spokesperson for the Republican Party. He had his ambitions as far as Speaker of the House, and so he did a lot of that. He wasn't an absentee father, but I have to say, and he would say it and she would say it, that he was gone a lot, and she was raising a young family, which I have always said the greatest title you can have is a mother, because they've got the most difficult job, but hers was even more difficult, given living in Washington in that environment and having her husband traveling a lot. So it was a difficult time for her.
And so at that point too, she begins, well, I think there's an injury along the way. There's an accident with a window, and she has some pinched nerve issue. And this kind of takes her into the spiral of prescription drugs and alcohol.
Prescription drugs and painkillers, because the nerve damage that she did in her neck was inoperable, and to the end of her life, it bothered her.
It did.
But the combination then of the painkillers, then some mood-altering stuff, because she was dealing with a depression, which at one point led to what was impolitely called in those days a nervous breakdown, coupled with alcohol, began to take its toll. And while it was not obvious in the White House, it was certainly known within the family that maybe there was something to be dealt with. But before we get to that, I do want to get to what I think 2 stories related to Betty Ford that really set the context for the White House years and everything that followed. When Richard Nixon was getting ready to leave the White House and was walking toward the helicopter with Mrs. Nixon, that iconic photograph of the 4 of them walking toward the helicopter. The Nixons get on the helicopter and depart. I'm next door in the executive office building waiting to get in for clearance for President Ford's swearing in. And you could see it on the TV, and I watched as he turned and said something to her as they were walking back to the White House. What we all later learned is that what he said to her is, "We can do this." And the emphasis on "we" is so important when you consider Betty Ford. Then, just a month in the White House, she gets a diagnosis of breast cancer, a disease that simply was not discussed in public. It really wasn't. And her reaction to it within a couple of days of her recovery was to invite the Associated Press photographer, who she knew, to come into her recovery room in Bethesda Naval Hospital and take a picture of her in bed recovering from the surgery, with the message to the world that women needed to get out and get early detection, and that the men in their lives needed to encourage them to do it. And in so doing, she saved hundreds of thousands of lives, because women became concerned about and learned about how to deal effectively with breast cancer in its early stages. Then, when she found it necessary to enter Long Beach and go through detoxification and deal with the substance and alcohol dependency issues, she did it in public because she had been so public as First Lady. There's a really interesting word in politics today, Patrick, transparency. You know, who's going to be genuine? Who's the real deal? Betty Ford invented that simply by being herself.
Yes.
She spoke on issues of the day when First Ladies did not do that. She talked about diseases that were hidden, and she did all of this in public. And all of us are beneficiaries of her having done that.
Yeah. And that's where those two words of candor and courage really came about. If you had to pick two words for her legacy, if you looked at the citations on her Medal of Freedom, her Congressional Gold Medal, I've looked at all those citations, and there is not one that doesn't have those two words in it related to just what you said. And that will be her main legacy. It's an interesting, somebody made an interesting comment to me, that because it was so unique to talk about things at that time, this person wondered whether now, all these years later, when the young people have been exposed to this all the time, whether they really understand what that legacy is all about. But I think it's going to be a lasting legacy, and it'll come back through it. I have to go back to one thing. When they were walking to the helicopter, I was told this later, and I had to go back and look at the film clip, which is in the public part of the museum. She was being consoled by Mrs. Nixon. She was not consoling Mrs. Nixon. Mrs. Nixon was getting her to bear up. And they were very close. And I've looked at that, and you can, if you look at it close, you can just tell Mrs. Nixon's trying to help her out. And it's almost like when the president might have seen that to say what he said when they went back to the White House. We can do this.
And you talk about that transparency. There's a great, we have a clip of it here. It's Morley Safer interviewing Betty, and he's asking her about premarital sex and abortion, and here's what she had to say.
Well, what if Susan Ford came to you and said, Mother, I'm having an affair?
Well, I wouldn't be surprised. I think she's a perfectly normal human being, like all young girls. If she wanted to continue it, I would certainly counsel and advise her on the subject.
Among the things you have spoken about her abortion, which is kind of a taboo subject for the wife of the president. It's one of those things that...
Well, if you ask a question, you have to be honest exactly how you feel. And I feel very strongly that it was the best thing in the world when the Supreme Court voted to legalize abortion and, in my words, bring it out of the backwoods and put it in the hospitals where it belonged.
Well, not something that you would expect, but she laid it on the line, like you said. And that could have been, that was troublesome for Jerry because he was planning to run.
It was a difficult thing for everybody but him. The staff was just shocked. He wasn't. And he kind of smiled and said, you know, we'll get around this. It didn't bear heavily on him. That's the way she was. I mean, she always referred to her Midwest demeanor. That's the way she was brought up. She was brought up, if you're asked questions, you answer the question. And that's what she did. And she sometimes said, maybe I shouldn't have answered all of them, but I did. And of course, the one that's so common is the fact that when she was, you know, asked in her first White House press conference, they didn't know about her previous husband. And they asked and said, you know, you never told us. She was almost being scolded. She said, you never told us about that. And she looked him square in the eye and said, you never asked. Because that's what she was. She would answer questions and like to do it.
Betty Ford famously said, being a lady does not require silence.
I like that.
And if she was asked a question, she believed a reporter deserved an answer. And in that trait, by the way, she mirrored President Ford, who was exactly the same. Mm-hmm. He actually liked some reporters. He didn't always like everything they wrote,
Yeah.
but he had very respectful relationships with many reporters, and it was of mutual respect because he answered their questions.
What did you enjoy about them while you were out covering and getting to know the Ford family?
Well, I had the opportunity to produce for Wood TV and anchor the coverage for the opening of the Ford Museum. And in preparation for that, our photographer Tom O'Rourke and I went out to California for several days and spent it with the Fords and had much wonderful and personal engagement with President and Mrs. Ford. They were so excited about what the museum was looking like, how it had come together, what it meant to Grand Rapids, and what it meant to them, because each of them is treated inside the exhibit. And often First Ladies are looked upon in support roles, and they do wonderful, wonderful things and support important causes. Betty Ford had been a First Lady like no other except maybe Eleanor Roosevelt. She deserved a big corner of the museum, and she got it, and I think they were both delighted. She was just completely engaging, very direct, great answers, and by this time she had completed her detox at Long Beach and was knee-deep in work on the Betty Ford Center at Eisenhower, which would open the following year.
Right.
And we talked much about how proud she was of that center and what she hoped it would accomplish.
Would all of this had happened, there's that time before Spiro Agnew resigns and Nixon's in office, and then Jerry Ford is named vice president. And
I called her that afternoon and said, imagine this. I said, if he gets a call from Nixon, would you call me back and let me know? And we both laughed. And she said, well, don't worry, he isn't going to call. Well, he did, to which then Congressman Ford said to his wife, who wasn't really eager about what this might bring, he said, don't worry, Betty, vice presidents don't do anything.
Yes, that's what he said.
And his brothers both told me that they believed this would be the capstone of his career. He'd served three years as vice president, presiding over the Senate and making speeches and planting trees and smiling, and that actually Jerry and Betty would get to spend more time together. Well, as we all know, it didn't exactly turn out that way.
yeah, that was the plan. They were going to retire.
There was no question. They had planned the retirement. They really had. There was just no question. He was finished with Congress. He was going to go home and practice law.
And here's a clip from that life-changing moment.
It was an ordinary night until...
And the phone rang at the house. Dad got on the phone. I think General Alexander Haig was on the other end of that line, letting Dad know that that President Nixon was calling to ask him to be vice president.
And it's only then that Mrs. Ford learns, in effect, that her whole life is about to be turned upside down. And oh, by the way, in 2 hours you have to be in the East Room of the White House to be introduced to the country.
And I remember my mother saying to Dad, she wasn't crazy about him being vice president. She just got him ready to resign. And Dad said, Betty, don't worry. Vice presidents don't do anything.
My fellow Americans, I proudly present to you the man whose name I will submit to the Congress of the United States for confirmation as the Vice President of the United States, Congressman Gerald Ford of Michigan.
I was very much in awe of the situation, but this recognition that he was receiving seemed to just also flow out to me, and I felt very important.
Nixon, when it's all over, turns to Betty and says, "Congratulations." And she looks at him and says, "Congratulations or condolences?"
On December 6, 1973, Ford was sworn in as vice president.
Of the office on which I'm about to enter.
So help me God.
So help me God.
And I believe Betty said after he's sworn in, congratulations or condolences, because now life is about to change, and really for the better for her. It's almost as though she goes through this metamorphosis. I mean, she's always been this strong person, but now she can really come out and take on some of the topics of the day and take them on head on.
I think that's very true. I think she really blossomed. I think she, going back to that childhood I talked about before, this was her opportunity to be on stage in a sense that she had a lot of things on her mind that she had an opportunity to express. If it wasn't the ERA, it was why isn't there a woman on the Supreme Court? But she had her opportunity to do it, and she did it well.
Yeah, she said, I'm a feminist.
That's right.
She came right out and was all about ERA, and again, that's who she was.
Yeah.
So when you look at that time though, you have to gauge it. Was it good for Jerry in running for president? Because there was a lot of backlash, but on the flip side, there were a large number of people saying, "Good for you, I'm on board."
Well, I don't always think that polls are what ought to replace the Bible for correctness in terms of political analysis. But let's offer this: when President Ford pardoned Richard Nixon and pardoned Vietnam War veterans, two very controversial acts done almost within a month of each other, his poll numbers dropped into the 40s and stayed there for a very long while. Within 3 weeks of the time that Mrs. Ford did that interview with Morley Safer that we just saw, her numbers went to 75% and stayed there through the end of the Ford presidency.
And that helped him out as well.
Not only helped him out, it showed the country warmed to someone who was candid, spoke her mind, and was transparent in doing so.
The detox was difficult, though. The family had to confront her that it was time. And from what I understand, I mean, Jerry was there. He'd always been the rock, and was there just to show her, hey, there's love in this family, and this is something that we need to do. This family is just tremendous. Just getting to know all of them over time, and they have, like you had mentioned before, those Midwestern roots.
They do.
And how's the family doing today as they deal with the funeral arrangements?
Well, I haven't talked directly to them, but I know I've heard that they're doing extremely well under the circumstances. Needless to say, it's a tremendous loss to them, because if you go back again in history, her role as a mother was extensive, maybe more than other mothers in bringing them up. But it's harder. If you remember President Ford's funeral, Steve had a very, very hard time. They all were, but Steve had a real problem because he was a bachelor. He had bonded with his father. He'd convinced his father to go out and play 3 holes of golf after he said he'd never play golf again. And probably my guess would be maybe Susan might at this time be having the most difficulty. If you were to compare them, that'd be just my guess. She was very close to her mother, and she played a role with her mother in the later years, so I think it'd be difficult for her. But they were a good family, and they did have that. Even though they didn't live in Grand Rapids, they still inherited that Midwest demeanor that he had and she had.
I've had opportunities to speak with Susan, and she'll tell you, the stress was always on education, but as an individual, go do whatever it is that you need to do and be your own person. And again, you just see this confluence of the personalities and beliefs of both Betty and Gerald and the kids. It continues on.
Well, the president famously said, Betty and I raised our children to have minds of their own, and they do, and they speak for themselves, and not always with our approval.
They would shock him once in a while. Steve always, I love Steve telling the story that, he was scheduled to go to Duke when the president became president. And he went to his father and said, Dad, I don't think I should go to school. I think it'd be an imposition with Secret Service people on other students, and I just don't think I should do that. And he looked at him very pleasantly and said, well, I'm proud of you. He said, what are you going to do? And he said, I'm going to be a cowboy. And it sort of shocked his father a little bit. I don't think he expected that, but that's what he did. He went out and became a cowboy.
How will you remember Betty?
Well, I'll remember her beyond the well-documented courage and candor, which we'll all remember. I'll remember her for her wit. I will permanently have fixed in my mind the picture of her standing on the cabinet table in a very dignified posture when she did that on the last day she was in the White House. That spelled a lot. And I will remember the last time I was with her in California. And we were sitting in the dining room just talking like we're talking today. And she looked over at me and said, you know something, Marty? If I'd known that I was going to live this long, I probably would have behaved myself a little better. But then she got this big smile and said, but I sure had fun. And it's the fun and the wit of her that unfortunately everybody didn't see, but it was there. That's what I'll remember most.
Matt, 30 seconds.
I will remember the "we can do it" that President Ford said to her. Few presidents have been helped as much by their spouse as Gerald Ford was by Betty.
Matt McLogan, Ford Foundation spokesperson, and Marty Allen, Chairman Emeritus of the Ford Foundation. Thank you both so much for joining us. We truly appreciate your thoughts.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
And thank you for joining us this week. We'll see you next week on West Michigan Week.